So this is 4.2. We're talking about position, relative versus absolute. We already kind of talked about relative versus fixed, but we're going to learn about the property of absolute and what absolute, well, fixed fixes it on the page. Absolute does something a little bit different, and hopefully you'll see the pattern once we talk about that. So first run the exercise. This is what we get. We get we have a first div and a second div. Maybe we should have called it blue div and yellow div. Let's just call it that so it's easier. Blue div and yellow div. And see, if we run that, nothing shows up, right? Because we don't have the name. So let's call this blue. And let's call this yellow. Run. Okay, so we have a blue div and a yellow div, and background color is blue, 100 by 100. The yellow one's 100 by 100. And we have these classes assigned to it. One is absolute, and it's 20 pixels and 20 pixels from the top and 20 pixels to the left. And one's relative. We already talked about relative. Relative basically just states that it is relative to where it should be. It should be 20 pixels from the top and 20 pixels to the left of where it should be. And if I had to guess, I'd have to guess that yellow was supposed to be right under blue as a block, has been moved 20 from the top and 20 to the left. And I would assume that the yellow div has a relative position class, and it's true. So, and nothing has been given the absolute position example. So apply the class absolute position example to the second div. All right, so instead of relative, we're going to say it's an absolute position example. Absolute position example to the second div, which is the yellow div. And if I run that, do you notice that this has been moved up, and it actually moves 20 pixels to the right and 20 pixels away from the top of the page. Basically, it gets removed from the flow of the page. It's no longer a block it's a block in the position of the page. It gets moved towards, it gets moved out of the flow of the page, and it's now an absolute entity on its own. Now, remove that class, and now apply relative to the second div. Okay, we already did that. That was basically the first thing we did. If we remove it, it's relative to where it should be. Now, a better way to look at this is to just say, okay, what if it was 0 and 0? So it's the default. And relative, what relative does, it just places it exactly where it's supposed to be. This absolute position example, Control C, well, if I give it to the blue, if I give the blue div a class of absolute position example, blue div is going to be removed from the flow of the page, and all of these are going to be moved up. Run. And now what blue has done, it has moved 20 down and 20 to the right, just like stated from the absolute 0 of the page, which is over here. If I say 0 and 0, it's simply going to move all the way up to the top of the page. If I say 100 from the top, well, it's just 100 all the way down. And yellow, the second div, hasn't moved anywhere. It's right there in position of the page. That's where it's supposed to be. If I change this yellow to absolute, which is kind of silly, what happened now? Let's move that. That's 100 pixels. So the yellow was actually, that's not a smart way to change it. We should we should just give it a relative position. Instead of relative position, just call it absolute position example. And we run the same thing. Well, what happened here? Absolute position example, yellow div. Oh, they're both basically in the same spot, right? So they were given the same class. That's why I did it in the first place, although it wasn't smart. They both moved 100 pixels from the top, but 0 from the left. But you get how absolute starts at the top of the page. It just works from the absolute 0 of the page right here where the mouse is pointing and moves from that position. And the relative position example is relative to where it should be on the page. And that's basically all there was to learn from this exercise. Just submit and you're done.